All right, so now we're moving on to doctrine within Judaism. So some of the core beliefs or characteristics, we'll say, of Judaism, because as we'll see in this slide, belief in matters of faith are not central to Judaism. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is ethical monotheism. So we've already discussed and you've read about the fact that Judaism is a monotheistic tradition, right? So there is one God. It's not one high God or one God above other gods. There's one capital G God for the entire world. So the world was created by one God. All of humanity was created by one God. And that God is a good God. So that is why Judaism especially is called an ethical monotheism. So this is one of the sort of the gifts that Judaism gives to the world that Prothero talks about that is continued in other traditions like Christianity and Islam. So God is the God of everyone. God is wholly powerful, is all-knowing, is omnipotent, is omniscient, and is also wholly good. So God is ethical. God himself is good, and he wants human beings to be good. So even though there is only one God in existence and all other deities or beliefs in other gods are considered false in Judaism, the Jewish people play a special role in that creation because they are God's chosen people. So this is a term that you've read about. You may have heard before taking this class that the Jews consider themselves the chosen people. And this comes from the fact that God chooses Abram. God chooses the man who becomes Abraham to have this special relationship with, right? To have this covenantal relationship. So the Jewish people, as the descendants of Abraham, are God's chosen people because of God's original choosing of Abraham and his descendants to have this special relationship with. But it's important to know what this term, the chosen people, means. It does not mean, for Jews, it does not mean that you have an easier time in this life. Being the chosen people for the Jews actually means that things are a lot harder. It's not, as I said, it's not the easy road to be the chosen people. One, as we'll see, it's more difficult because it means that Jews are contractually or covenantally bound to the law that is given by God. So in our next dimension, we'll talk about ethics, we'll talk about the halakha, the mitzvot, the Jewish law code, but there are many, many specific instructions that God gives to his chosen people that they need to follow. They have to live by this law. And it's not just, the 10 Commandments, if you're familiar with those. There are hundreds and hundreds of these laws. So being God's chosen people, one means that you have been chosen to be holy. You have been chosen to live a life that is different from the rest of humanity and that is much stricter, is set apart, and is one that focuses on justice, holiness, and mercy. So the Jewish people have a more difficult path in this world because they are called to follow all of these different laws. Although as we talk about the different denominations in Judaism today, we'll talk about the different interpretations of that law that exist today. So it's more difficult in that one sense. It's also more difficult in the sense that, as Prothero talks about, being God's chosen people doesn't mean that you have an easier time as a community. Right? The story of Judaism is one of persecution, it's one of exile, it's one of enslavement. So it actually means that your road through this world as a community is going to be tougher because you're going to face persecution. As a people who are set apart, who live this very different lifestyle, if you are following Jewish law, your lifestyle is going to look very different, right? You eat different foods, you wear different clothes, you behave in a different way. So that is always going to become a target for persecution. So being the chosen people is, of course, for the Jewish people a great honor, that they are the descendants of the man that God chose to enter into this relationship with. but it actually means that things are harder for the Jews than they are for other people. Their lifestyle, their law code is very strict and very difficult to follow because it just entails so many different laws that cover every aspect of human life. And it also means that you're going to become a target for persecution. But because of this, the idea is that the Jewish people's role in creation is to be that people set apart, is to be a holy people, to try their best to enact justice and mercy in the world, so that other people who are non-Jews will know of the existence of God and will know of the characteristics of God by looking at the Jewish people. So they are also meant to be sort of like a beacon of light or a spotlight that shines on God, so that other people will be drawn to God through the Jewish people. Doesn't mean they have to convert to Judaism. Judaism is a non-missionary religion, but that they will become aware of God through knowledge of the Jewish people, and then they can enter into a relationship with God themselves. So you don't have to convert to Judaism to know God, to worship God, and to have a relationship with God. Jews just see themselves as sort of having this special role in God's creation to bring others to the one God. So that's sort of where this term, the chosen people, comes from, and how it's seen not as meaning you get a free pass in this world or an easy road in this world. It actually means that your life, in many ways, is going to be more difficult than for those who are not Jewish. The second point that I have here is emphasis on practice. Prothero talks about this a lot in the chapter, and he calls it an emphasis on orthopraxy over orthodoxy. So what that means is that Judaism is a religious tradition that focuses more on what you do than on what you believe. In Judaism, there are not a lot of articles of faith or matters of faith that all Jewish people agree on. There is sort of the centrality, of course, of God, right? That there is one high God, and that the Jews have a special relationship with that God. But other than that, and even those core matters are something that are questioned and debated, which we'll talk about in a second. The emphasis is on how you live your life, right, and how you live your life in this world. So Judaism is a tradition that emphasizes ritual, it emphasizes community, it emphasizes telling the story, as Prothero mentions. So it's much more about what you do in this world than about what you believe. What you believe about God and the Torah and your interpretations, that's something that one is personal. So it's sort of a personal matter between you and God. And it's something that should never be fixed. You should always be seeking a better understanding of God and God's relationship with the Jewish people and history and things like that. So it's never sort of fixed in time. It's never a settled matter. It's something that always has to be further investigated and interpreted. So Judaism is very much about what this community does and how they live their life in this world. Which should be in a way that, again, sort of shines that light on God's justice, His mercy, His loving character, things like that. So there are really a wide range of beliefs and interpretations that exist within Judaism, because that's not the central focus in Judaism. The central focus is on what you do, right? How you live your life, how you follow the law, or live out God's justice and mercy in your life. And that's really the central character, central feature of Judaism. Then sort of connected to that, if the emphasis is on what you do and not so much on what you believe, it's not that matters of theology and interpretation and belief are not important. The difference here is that, as I mentioned, there is not just one, interpretation or one belief that all Jews share. There are multiple ideas and beliefs and interpretations that are allowed, so to speak. So We mentioned this already, the term Israel, and the reading talks about this. The word Israel itself comes from the Torah, so it comes from the Hebrew Bible. It comes from a particular story in which one of Abraham's descendants, a man named Jacob, comes across a man in the desert, and they end up fighting, like actually having a physical fight with each other. They end up wrestling. After the fight, the man reveals himself to be sort of like an angelic figure or a divine figure in some way connected to God. And he tells Jacob, because you have wrestled with God, your name is going to be Israel. So the word Israel has a history that goes back much farther than the land being called Israel. But the word Israel means someone or a person who wrestles with God. Right? It is to wrestle with God, to struggle with God. Jacob is renamed Israel. That name is then extended to the people, the Israelites, and it is then extended to the land that God promised to the Jewish people, which becomes the land of Israel. So this idea of the people of Israel, a people who struggle with God or wrestle with God, is very much enshrined in this idea within Judaism that, as I have here, multiple interpretations are allowed. And a sort of further aspect of this is what Prothero talks about, that sort of the sanctity of dialogue and the sanctity of debate. In Judaism, there are core texts. There are, which we'll talk about in a minute, there's the Torah, there's the Talmud. So there are texts that are very important. They are seen as, in the case of the Torah, words of God, the words that were inspired by God. In the case of the Talmud, interpretations of those words. But those texts don't have a fixed meaning, right? Nothing in the Torah, nothing in the Hebrew Bible has a fixed meaning, meaning that, oh, this is what this verse means. This is exactly what God meant. Now that we've figured it out, we don't have to talk about it anymore, right? It means the same thing for all people at all times. This matter is settled. That is not a part of the Jewish tradition. In the Jewish tradition, studying the Torah, having discussions about what verses from the Torah means, and actually debating or fighting about those is a sacred activity. The idea is that if the words are divine, right, if the words of the Torah come from God, then the proper response to those words are to continually try to understand them better. And that as the world changes, as history goes on, as time goes on, the meanings of those verses can change as well, right? What a verse meant, in 1200 BC is going to be different than what that verse meant in, 70 CE, than what it's going to mean today, because the world changes and the Jewish community changes. God doesn't change, the Torah doesn't change, but learning more and more about what those verses can mean and how they can be applied, that is the sacred duty of Jewish people. It is to never stop learning, to never settle on a fixed meaning, right? Because then you stop engaging with the text and you stop engaging with others about God and about God's words to the Jewish people. So multiple interpretations of any verse in the Torah is allowed. Right, so this is why we get these sort of wide range of ideas on matters like even the existence of God, what happens after death, that there is no one sort of official Jewish teaching on these things. There are discussions and debates and dialogues about these core matters of faith, but it's not like everyone has to accept the same thing. The one thing you have to accept is that you need to continually strive to learn more and to understand it better. And this is that wrestling with God. Really, in Judaism, it's wrestling with God's words. It's wrestling with God's teachings. That the Jewish people have a responsibility to continue to wrestle with them, to always try to be learning more about them and understanding them better. So this word Israel has a very profound and significant meaning for what it means to be Jewish and what it means to interact with the sacred text of Judaism. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the sacred texts of Judaism. The first one that I have here, so I have this under cosmology, right, because this is where we find truth in the world. So where we find information about this one God, this one capital G God. And that's in the Tanakh or the Torah. So most of you probably already know that Judaism has one sacred text, one central sacred text. Usually the term Torah is used for it. Sometimes you may have also heard it called the Hebrew Bible. Most of this text is in the Christian Bible, if you're familiar with the Christian Bible, although Christians call it the Old Testament, but of course Jews don't call it the Old Testament, because for them it is the Testament, right? It is the sacred scripture. So there's a couple different names or words for this text. It's called the Tanakh, or the Torah, or the Hebrew Bible. As Prothero mentions in the text, the word Torah is very sort of elastic and extensive when it comes to Judaism. So the word Torah means law or path or way. And specifically, when Jews use the word Torah, they could be referring to two different things. They could be referring to just the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You don't have to know the names of all those 5 books, but in the Hebrew Bible, those are the first 5 sections, and because those are the sections in which the law is revealed, they are oftentimes called the Torah. That's the Torah, that's the law, that's the section of the Hebrew Bible that gives the law. The Torah, those 5 books together, really are sort of the core of the Hebrew Bible, even though there are other writings that come after that. And if you go to a Jewish synagogue, they do a Torah reading each week on the Sabbath. So they read a section of the Torah. They read it in Hebrew. And they actually don't just read it, they sing it. So to be able to do the Torah reading, you actually have to train to know how to read Hebrew and to know how to sing the verse properly. That's a part of your preparation for your bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. But the image behind me is actually of a Torah scroll. So this is a piece of parchment on which the entire Torah is written on one piece of paper or one piece of parchment. It can also be like actual animal hide, animal skin. And it's rolled up in this scroll fashion. And this is how synagogues do their Torah readings each week, even to this day. If you go to a synagogue, they don't open a book of the Torah. They won't open a book form. They will take out a Torah scroll, like the one behind me, and they are about maybe 3 feet high. These are very large scrolls, and they will unroll the scroll to where the reading for the week is, and then someone will do the Torah reading. So the word Torah literally means law, but it can also mean a way or a path, like Prothero mentions, and sometimes is used to refer to just those first 5 books, which are really very central in Judaism. But the word itself can also refer to the entire Hebrew Bible, which is a bit longer than that. Prothero goes into the other sections, which are the Ketubim and the Nevi'im. So it can the word itself can also refer to the entire book. The word Tanakh that I have here, that's the Hebrew word that refers to the entire Hebrew Bible. So it actually is an acronym for those sections, because the Tanakh is the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, which are the 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible. So the Torah is the law. It's where the sections that the law is revealed in. The Nevi'im are the prophets. So there are several sections that talk about different prophets. In the history of Judaism, people who believed that the Jewish community was not living up to their side of the covenant, and sort of called out those injustices and asked the people to return to better behavior, better ways. And then the last one are the Ketuvim, and Ketuvim just means writings. And it's a collection of sections or books that have like poetry in them and meditations and songs and hymns. And this would be, if you're familiar with the Hebrew or Christian Bible, texts like Lamentations, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, things like that. So those are the three sections, and Prothero talks about those in detail. But the Torah is really central to Judaism. Remember, this is the time of book-based Judaism. It's a book-based religion. And the Torah itself is viewed as really a letter from God to his children, right? A letter from God to his people, to his chosen people. So that's also why it's so important that the Jewish people remain engaged with the text, right? Not just to settle on a meaning for a verse, but to continue through history and through time to debate and dialogue what that verse means. The Torah is so central and beloved within Judaism that at those synagogue services or Shabbat services that I mentioned, before they actually unroll the Torah scroll to read from it, the Torah will actually be held by an individual. As I mentioned, these scrolls are very big, they're very heavy. Someone will take out the Torah scroll and actually walk the Torah around the sanctuary, around the main, part of the worship space where everyone is gathered. And people will like kiss their hands and put it near the Torah, or touch one of the fringes on the covering of the Torah, to show their love and devotion for this piece of writing, because it is sacred, because it is a letter from God. So the Torah is just very central and very important to Jewish life today. Then after the Torah, the second term I have down here is Talmud. And the Talmud is also referred to as the oral Torah. So the Torah was compiled over several hundred years in the history of Judaism. But after the Torah was sort of completed, compiled, and finalized, that tradition of debating and conversing about what Torah verses mean started, right? So you had the Torah, you had these verses, but you also had this practice, this sacred practice of dialogue and debate. What does this verse mean? What does this law mean? How do we continue to follow this law, even if we no longer live in the land of Israel, or after the temple has been destroyed? How can we still remain true to this law or this teaching of God if we can't literally follow it anymore? And so that cycle of debate and interpretation, went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's what the Talmud is. So the Talmud, there's several different Talmuds. The most important, though, is the Babylonian Talmud, and it is a collection of these debates. So it is a recording written down of many of these debates about what Torah verses mean, that became very honored and respected within the community. So if you'll do some readings from the Talmud, so you do have some required readings to see a little bit some of these stories, different rabbis talking about their interpretations of the Torah, what they think the Torah means. But if you ever look at a page of the Talmud in Hebrew, it looks very different, and it'll have like a little Torah verse in the middle, and then all the way around that it will have different sort of selections or sayings from different rabbis over hundreds of years about their interpretations of that Torah verse, or their interpretation of what someone else said about the Torah, so that this practice of debate and dialogue is actually enshrined within the second most sacred text, or the second most important text in Judaism, which is the Talmud. And the idea is that the Talmud just records a couple hundred years of this, but it is the responsibility of the Jewish community to continue this practice, right? That what the rabbis did in the Talmud, it's not done, right? It's not completed. You have to continue this practice of debate and dialogue about the meaning of Torah verses. And then the next term I have written down here is human history. And this just means that because Judaism is a tradition that sees God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and intimately connected with the Jewish people, because they are his chosen people, and part of the covenant is having that special relationship, that you can look to human history to see, teachings of God or messages of God, in the sense that, if things happen in the world, God has control over all those things, right? God is completely in control of what happens in the world. So if something good happens to the Jewish people, that could be interpreted as a reward. If something bad happens to the Jewish people, that could be interpreted as a punishment. And this theme is spoken of at length in the Torah and the Talmud about different historical times for the Jewish people, and whether or not they were being rewarded for good behavior or punished for bad behavior. So it's something that has been existent in Judaism for a very long time, but today is not necessarily something that all Jews would share, because really the occurrence of the Holocaust challenged this notion so deeply that it sort of split the Jewish community. There are some Jews who still think that you can look to human history to see teachings of God or lessons of God for the Jewish people. And there are some Jews that said, well, if God let the Holocaust happen, if he really was all powerful, or, if he really did have a hand in human history, he wouldn't have let that happen. So there are many Jews today who just are a little bit more cautious and hesitant about looking to events that happen in human history and seeing them as an act of God, because sometimes it's hard to square up what happens in the world with a possible religious teaching. But traditionally, this has been a category of knowledge in Judaism, right? We can look to what is occurring with or to the Jewish people, and we can find some sort of teaching or lesson from God in those occurrences. Then the last thing I have here in terms of soteriology, right? How do Jews see, what do they see as the main problem with humanity and how to overcome it? The main problem would be sort of a lack of relationship with God, and subsequently not following the law. So in Judaism, the two most important things that are done are to keep the law and to have faith in God. Although really keeping the law is the most important. In terms of faith in God, it is sort of central and foundational in Judaism that there is belief in God, that there is belief that God is the one God, and has a special relationship with the Jewish people. Although when we get to society and talking about modern Judaism, there are many Jews today who say that that's not important, that Judaism is a tradition that can continue even without a belief in God. So the focus becomes law. The focus is again sort of put on how do you live your life? How does the Jewish community act in this world? Are they living up to their side of the covenant in terms of, displaying ethics and justice and mercy, and shining that spotlight on the characteristics of God? So it's very important to follow that law, although keeping with this idea of Israel and multiple interpretations allowed. There are definitely various understandings of how to follow the law and which portions of the law need to be kept today. Okay, so that's all we have for doctrine. And then next up, we're going to talk about ethics in Judaism, and we'll talk much more specifically about this law. What is the Jewish law code, and how is it enacted today by different denominations of Judaism?